morning, everybody, and welcome to firstly the second day of the conference and also to this first concurrent session for the day. My name is Anita Wheeldon. I'm from the University of Southern Queensland, and I would like to acknowledge that today I am on Jarrabul and Garrawaya First Nations people's land, a beautiful place to live and work. It's my absolute pleasure today to chair this session for Tim Kastelle and Veronica Nolan. Tim is from the University of Queensland Business School, and Veronica is from Aurecon and is partnering with Tim today in this presentation to look at using industry partnerships and human-centred design to create novel learning opportunities. And so with that, very quickly, I'll hand over to Tim. The stage is yours.
Thank you. So we just want to run through basically a very small case study of some experiences that we've had over the last couple of years. And sort of the impetus for all of this is just trying to think about how do we actually teach effectively and help people learn effectively with using all the new tools that are around. And one of the things that has kind of occurred to, I think, both Veronica and I is that perhaps the answer isn't in using all kinds of new tools. Maybe it's actually in combining some things that have been around for a while. And so, we think about a lot of our pedagogies right now as being tech-driven, or at least tech-enabled. But what we've experienced in our collaboration over the last 2 years is that some older kind of ideas can be fairly novel and have some fairly big impacts. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And it's interesting that, both Veronica and I are John Dewey fans. And so, he was writing back in the very early parts of the 20th century. And this quote, I think, really captures a lot of what drives the work that both of us do. Where we're really trying to get people to act differently and to come up with different mindsets. And doing that, we really try to tap into this idea of the imagination. And so what I want to do to just kind of set the stage a little bit is talk a little bit about, 21st century skills. What is it that people need to be effective today? What is it that they need to learn to be effective today? And I'm going to start with a question that I keep coming back to a lot. I was the MBA director here at UQ for a couple of years, and I've been heavily involved in MBA teaching for the whole 15 years that I've been here. And I think this question of why was it so hard to copy Toyota, to me is a really fascinating question, because they started lean manufacturing in the 50s. Other automobile manufacturers in the 70s and 80s decided that they should try to copy that approach. And it took them 20 or 25 years to actually work out how to do it. And so the question is, well, what made that so hard? This is a very long quote from one of my favorite books, The Knowing Doing Gap, by Jeff Pfeffer and Bob Sutton. And what they basically did, they talked to this guy, Mike DePriel, from the Toyota, who was a Toyota production system expert, right? And he basically said, look, the techniques are simple, right? Because the thing with Toyota is none of this was a secret. They gave tours of all of their plants. They wanted people to copy their approach because they thought it was so effective and so exciting. And so they escorted people through the plants every single day. Their competitors, their collaborators, their suppliers, everyone went through the Toyota plants. And the thing that Mike DePriel, the point that he's making here is that when you go through a tour like that, you can see on the surface what people are doing. You can see the techniques. You can see the andon cord that you pull the cord and the production line stops. And the point that he makes at the end is that Toyota production system looks simple, but it actually has 3 levels. Right? There's techniques, there's systems, and there's philosophy. And the issue is that everyone wants to copy the technique, but if you do that without having the underlying philosophy, it doesn't work, which I think is a really important issue, because then if you look at it and you say, well, what is it that we actually teach people? We end up, and I say this not as an indictment, and I include myself in this, but a lot of times we end up teaching techniques, right? We have a framework. We have, if you're a management scholar, you teach 2x2 matrices. That's how that's how you know you're learning management, is if somebody shows you, here's a 2x2, and this is one important thing, and here's another important thing, and if you do both, you're up and to the right, then everything's good. Right? That's a technique. It's a model. It's a tool. But if you don't have that underlying philosophy, and Toyota had many, several important components. Everyone counts. Everyone has the authority to pull the cord. Everyone has the ability to make a contribution and to make a decision. Right? It was that underlying philosophy that was so radically different. And so when other companies tried to copy the techniques, but they didn't have that philosophy, it failed. And that's what actually made it so hard to copy Toyota. So I think this is really important then when we start thinking about, well, what is it that people need to learn? This is from the World Economic Forum, and this came out in 2015. They've updated it subsequently every single year. Nothing really changes that much in it. And so this was surveying managers, and they said, when you're hiring new people, what are the skills that are most important for you? What are you looking for? Right? And if you look at those top 10 skills that people are looking for, it's all the kinds of things that everyone says, yeah, that's really important. And then if you say, well, how are we teaching it? People struggle a little bit, right? So complex problem solving, critical thinking, creativity. That's back to John Dewey and imagination, right? Coordinating with others. Judgment. How do we teach judgment? I was doing some work with a bank a couple of years ago, and I was talking with their director of HR, and we were talking about the MBA, and she said, well, the what is it that you're really trying to do in that program? I said, for me, the number one skill that managers need to have is being comfortable with ambiguity. And she looked at me for a little bit, and she said, well, how do you teach that? Right, because that gets at all of these skills, right? It's another one of these core skills that's fuzzy, right? And it's not a technique. And my answer to that was, you teach comfort with ambiguity by making people work on problems where there's no one set answer, right? We actually need to get people in situations where, ambiguity, uncertainty, and doubt are central to their operation, which then gets us to these projects that we've been running. So within the MBA program for 15 years, I've been running various different types of capstone programs where we get students to do precisely that. We give them important industry-based problems. We say, have a crack at this. They do. None of them have a correct answer. It drives people nuts because I can't tell them marking criteria because we want them to come up with something novel and exciting. And then they say, well, tell you what novel and exciting looks like. It's not novel and exciting, right? So we get into this paradox of how do we make that work? And so with the UQ Aurecon partnership, we have a high-level memorandum of understanding between the two organizations that was signed a couple of years ago when RVC and Aurecon CEO were together at a Champions of Change event, and they were talking about sustainability, and they realized that there was a high level of connection between the two organizations, and so they signed this MOU. There's a management committee that tries to guide the collaboration, and then when it gets down to, okay, well, what do we actually do? Then the CEOs and the VCs aren't around anymore. It comes down to me and Veronica and a handful of others that actually have to figure out, well, what does this partnership actually look like, and what are we going to do? And so what we've done over the past couple of years is we've done versions of these problems that aren't that aren't solvable, and we've been bigger ones than the ones we focused on, but I think it gives and people within our chance to really think about how do we attack these kinds of problems. And so we've run a couple of projects the last 2 years. Last year we ran projects where the focal question was, what will be the new major export opportunities for Australia in 2030? We gave people a handful of tools, but that's basically an exploratory type question. And then currently, we're working with some undergraduate students in the Liveris Academy for Leadership and Innovation, which just launched within UQ a couple of years ago. And there we're looking at Gladstone, right, which has been a highly coal-dependent economy for many, many years. They're looking at basically an end date for coal as an economy driver. And so their fundamental question is, what do we look like from 2035 on? And so we've got the students working on developing an investment thesis for Gladstone for a few years down the road. And there are a couple of sets of features that are very common across these projects, right? They're open-ended, they're practical, and they're relevant. We're using design thinking. We're explicitly using design thinking and human-centered design approaches to help the students solve these problems. And I think the critical thing here is that it's basically the main tool that we're using is we're telling people, go out and talk, go out and have conversations with others. We're not doing surveys. We're not looking for secondary data that we can analyze. We're trying to learn about this problem by figuring out what's actually important to the stakeholders and then going from there, which is the critical thing. So, I think all of this is sort of a combination, things that have existed previously, but that are combined in a relatively novel way, and in a way that have had some really nice impacts, both for the students involved and for the two organizations. I think one of the things that's been fascinating about this for me is that everyone that goes through a project like this changes, right? Whether you're in the student team or the industry sponsor, you end up being a different person than you were when you walked in. So now I'll kick over to Veronica to talk a little bit about some of the outcomes and some of the things we're thinking and have learned from going through this.
Great, thank you, Tim. So aesthetic literacy, how does that play a part in all of this? What I've been doing is looking at the inquiry aspect of design thinking. So, been working with Tim and our organisation using a design thinking methodology to approach innovation as one of the methodologies. And I was really interested in, what was sort of driving that. So I went back to John Dewey's work because I also work with arts-based inquiry, and I was trying to understand the nature of the aesthetic in our lives. And it was fascinating because what I discovered that Dewey had said was that the aesthetic is very bound with our with our capacity as human beings to address our needs. So he drilled it down to, as people on the planet, when we come into disharmony from our environment, that actually presents itself as a need. And our aesthetic capability actually starts to kick in. So when we talk about aesthetics, it's actually about our sensory perception. It's about our emotive response to what happens in our environment. It's about how our pattern sensing capability starts to come in. We look for patterns to sense make what's going on. Our intuition kicks in, and what I'm suggesting is that intuition is actually the holistic operation of all of our intelligences and all of our experiences in order to come up with a creative response and then to go from there. How does it relate to what we're doing? Well, as Tim said, when you bring in a human-centric methodology such as design thinking to innovate, you go to the people on the ground and their lived experience. And what you're looking for is to understand what their needs are, and often they're unarticulated needs. So people might tell you what they want, but as humans, we know that there's often a much bigger story going on. And so that's where we use our aesthetic capability to start to fathom what that is. We come up with a hunch as to what that is, and then we go away and we use a process to actually divine whether our hunch is right, and we start to test some solutions that might actually address those particular needs. So moving on from there, Tim. How does that relate to our 21st century skills and our 21st century mindset? If you think about those, that list of skills that have been articulated for some time by the World Economic Forum, you can see that design thinking and actually aesthetic literacy addresses quite a lot of those particular skills. And as Tim mentioned, what we're finding is that we don't really have a language to discuss those things and educate in those areas. And so why we've brought up this concept of the aesthetic literacy is we think that there's an opportunity for us to actually develop that language, talk about it much more effectively. It's these things that we call the soft skills. And if there's a term that I despise more on the planet, I'll let you know. But it's one of those things. It's time we change that terminology because we know it's definitely not soft and it's definitely not easy. And so as educators, and Tim and I, both clearly are, for want of a better term, we're very excited to be finding ways for us to be building this kind of literacy for our people from the very get-go on the planet right through to the end of our days. We're lifelong learners. But in our current roles, how do we get that brought into business? How do we get that brought into our educational facilities? And how do we help the people on the ground and the students who are looking to us to develop their capability in this complex and exciting and dynamic new future? I'd just like to share a little anecdote. I had one of the students say to me recently that I was talking with. I was going to introduce them to one of our experts in their field, and there was a beautiful moment of sincerity, humility, and a little nervousness from this student where they said to me, what can I bring to the conversation? What could we, these burgeoning scholars, actually bring to a conversation with an expert in their field? And I immediately said, well, none of us knows where the answers for innovation are going to come from. And that's the whole point of these methodologies, is to bring in people from diverse fields. We can't do it alone. And so how do we come together and share our ideas so that a solution can emerge? Then the other thing for me was that, and of course, we've all been there. At some point in our lives, we've been the novice. And in fact, we are often still the novice in situations when we step outside of our expertise. And that's a daunting place. This learning mindset, as opposed to a knowing mindset, is quite a strong trigger for many of us. And many people talk about it, but Leeke, Holt and Eldridge, in their recent book, Experiencing Design, bring it up. And Leeke maintains that really we've got to encourage people to move from that knowing mindset to the learning mindset. And that comes up with a whole host of complexity, because we're all conditioned to be knowers. It's the thing that you sell to people when you go for in a job interview. I'm sure I know things. But if we can get people to move into that space and say, look, I actually don't know, but I do know how to learn. It comes back to that old adage about give a person a fish and they'll eat for a day, teach them how to fish and they'll eat forever, assuming that they're a fish to be caught, but that's a whole different story and out of the scope of today's discussion, unfortunately. They're the things that we're exploring. The other thing about that anecdote was on retrospect, what I really would have liked to say to that student, and I will go back to her and say this, is that what can you bring as a scholar and a young person in this field? Well, it's your learning mindset. It's your desire to actually learn. It's your ability to say, yeah, I don't know, but I do know how to learn. And it's her ability to actually do that quite quickly and be open to learning. And they're the kinds of shifts that we're looking to support, and design thinking really does provide those opportunities as a process. But as Tim said, you have to bring the disposition with that. And so unless we can have those conversations about people's awareness, their own reflexivity on their mindsets and their ability to learn, then using the tools doesn't quite get us over the line. And so in terms of, we take that learning mindset at the level of the individual, at the level of team, but also at the level of the organisation. And there are many people, including Sengay and Ari Degus, who had introduced this term back in the 80s of the learning organisation. And what they introduced was concepts around that reflexivity, that individual learners need to bring in that self-mastery, and that includes the reflexivity, but also bringing in a systems thinking mindset where you are able to look at the whole and the parts at the same time in order to deal with complexity. It's things like shared vision. So how do we inspire people and engage them in imagining a different future from that which we currently have? It's about team learning, and it's also about adaptive and generative learning. And once again, that's where we believe that aesthetic literacy comes into the picture. I'm going to hand that back over to you, Tim, for a bit of a wrap up.
So look, so just to summarize, I think there's a couple of things that we've learned from doing this work. One is that when we were writing the abstract, I think it kind of hit both of us that this is almost primitive to teach people how to have discussions, right? Because everything's digital, and I teach innovation, and so I should be teaching tech, right? But I'm not. I'm teaching people how to talk, which I think is really interesting, right? It's sort of a flip of the way that we tend to think about it. The second thing is I think it's a challenging way to learn, and this is one of the things that one of the reasons why we teach techniques rather than philosophies is that techniques are really easy to assess. Right? You can do an exam, you can figure out who's absorbed something and can spit it back out. That's very different from trying to figure out, are you actually thinking differently? Are you acting differently? Do you have a different disposition and mindset? And so it's harder to teach and learn this way. And the other thing is, and Veronica and I have talked about this, both in her context where she is facilitating workshops and in my context where I'm doing that sometimes, but also teaching, and that is that we keep walking into rooms where we have no idea if what we're going to do is going to work, right? Which is terrifying. The simplest thing for me, right, is to say, here's 120 slides. I'm just going to work my way through it. It's a lot harder to walk in and say, I don't have anything. We're just going to do some exercises, and my assumption and I have faith that something cool will emerge from it by the end. It's a harder way to do things. And then the last thing, and this is really, Veronica very gracefully said but this is her core idea, and that is that aesthetic literacy is a really important part of this learning mindset. And it's this idea that basically integrates all the other intelligences that people have, so that we then get the kinds of outcomes that we're looking for. So that's a really quick summary of some of the work that we've been doing together over the last couple of years. And so I think that takes us now to questions.
Thank you very much. That was an absolutely brilliant presentation from you both, and I'm absolutely captivated by it. There are some questions that have come up in the discussion, actually, which I can lead off in. So one of the questions that has come out is in a large university organisation where people are still not open to design thinking, how can a professional staff lead the conversation and adaptation of design thinking? Does somebody want to grab that one? Tim, perhaps?
I might grab it. It's a front of mind question for me in a lot of respects. So look, I was in a session yesterday. We had 2 hours of all of the academics in the university. It's about 20 of us out of however hundreds we've got, all around a couple thousand that we've got here at UQ. And the 20 of us were the people that do co-design work. And we were just talking about, well, how can we get this more embedded across the university? And the discussion, we kind of said, well, maybe we need the KPIs, or maybe we need to have a discussion paper that gives some people guidance. And what we were basically trying to work out is how can we force people to think in this way? And as we went further and further and further through that discussion, we actually, got to the point where we said, well, actually, we're design thinkers. We obviously know this is wrong. What we actually need to do is get this practice embedded. And so, it's basically, I think, so the thing that I would say to that is we need to have projects, we need to run projects based on these principles that are successful. And then when people ask us how we did it, then we get those ideas to spread. And it's one of those things that sounds very simple, but it's not easy, which loops back to one of the very original discussion points around soft skills. Soft skills pretty much the definition of a soft skill is something that sounds really simple, that's diabolically hard to do in practice. Like that.
Perhaps that's the new name. Rather than soft skills, we'll call them diabolical skills, maybe. So we do have another question in the discussion forum at the moment asked by Lily, and she wants to know, when you're giving students their focal question or their industry problem, what kind of tools are you giving them to help them tackle that problem?
So I can pick that one up, Tim. So first of all, it does start as an industry problem, a challenge problem, and we actually use tools to develop the focal question. So, for example, we have a project scoping toolkit, and Maureen Thurston is our, she was our chief innovator, and she's now actually using design thinking to design the experience for our people and for our clients. So that's terribly exciting. But she was the one who instigated that, drawing on the work of Lidke and Ogilvy. But essentially what it does is you look at things like diagramming to help people download the ideas that they've got stored away. Then you come up with sort of a project statement to roughly, it's a heuristic about what you think is going on about the problem. And then you'd use tools that actually think about the people on the ground. So they often talk about personas, and that's what you're really looking at, is tools that get you to stand in the shoes of the people that you're designing for and empathise with them. And again, it's all hunch based until you go out and test it. But they're the kinds of things you can do to start to think, well, what's their why? What would matter to them? What's their experience of this challenge? And then you can use that to create your focal question. And again, you treat that like a heuristic, a hunch that you then start to go out and test in multiple ways. I hope that answers at least part of your question. That's just scratching the surface.
And there's another really great question in here too from Susie. And she has asked, what next would you love to see as effective industry and university collaboration for learning? Which I think is a wonderful question. Tim, perhaps you'd like to have a go at that one.
Yeah, look, I mean, Susie's actually as qualified to answer this one as we are. So it's a funny one. But I think the thing I would say is that it's not just for learning. Like for me, there's a gap between people in universities and people outside. And my whole thing is, how do we bridge that gap? How do we get people working more closely together, whether it's around solving important problems via qualified research, whether it's helping people learn better and learn these mindsets and ways of thinking. And I think, there's been some recent discussion around lean startup and design thinking, that a criticism that has said that a lot of times people see these tools and they see these frameworks and they just focus on filling them in. And the gap is in not having enough high quality data. And so to me, the thing I'm just obsessed with right now is just getting back to more conversations, right? And so for me, the thing I would love most is just having more conversations across university and industry, across university, industry, and community, right, across all of the different stakeholders that are important in the communities that we're trying to build collaboratively.
So we've got time for one more question, and perhaps I might take the liberty of making that my question. So I was just wondering, when you're working on these projects with industry, what is the feedback loop to industry? So what are they, I guess, getting out of it? Veronica, would you like to take that question perhaps?
Yeah, and I'm just, that was me in my thinking mode about, there's so many, things that we're getting out of it. And again, it's not that thing of, you guys go and produce this product or this thing for us to, consume at this end. It is very much about, working together, that we are exploring, this together, and hence why it's a partnership, because it truly is exploratory, rather than doing that end-to-end, process. That together we're looking at those solutions, together. and it still becomes part of an ongoing conversation. As we know, it's not just about this thing will magically pop up and away we go and all things are magic. It's quite an ongoing process. So we get insight, we get learning, and we develop that capability for ourselves, at the same time. And we're helping to be part of that development of the next generation of amazing, employees, for want of a better term.
The way that I always frame it, Anita, is that because like I said, I've been doing these projects for 15 years, and when I talk with potential industry partners, the thing I always say is that these projects are great for exploration, the exact word that Veronica just used. So if you've got something that is strategically important, but there's no set answer, like organizations are also not great at solving those kinds of problems or addressing those kinds of questions. And so this is a fantastic way to just get some fresh thinking and to get some new angles into problems that might be giving you fits, and maybe have been giving you fits for a long period of time. So I think it's a really effective way for universities and industry to work together.
Thank you both, Tim and Veronica. I've just loved this session. It was just absolutely wonderful, and for me anyway, this is what universities are all about, and this is what we contribute to our society. So thank you very much. With that is the end of this particular session, and everybody will have about 5 minutes now to pop over into your next one of 3 concurrent sessions. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, Anita. Bye.